taking up our time and energy with the past, taking up our time and energy with the way we've always done things before, is preventing us from hearing Jesus's call to get out back in the boat, but try it a different way this time. We are beginning our journey through Lent once again this year, and we're using the worship series, A Wandering Heart, created by a sanctified art. And there's multiple different ways that you can dive into this worship series and explore the Gospels through this season of Lent. There's an online devotional that's part of this series. You can also have it printed in the office if you need a paper copy because you can't access it online. We have children's bulletins, and even on our social media, we've been sharing poems and art and music that go along with this series. And this journey through Lent, even though we take it every year, it's different because we are different. Every year. We're at different seasons in our lives. We have different people that we're in relationship with. And so it requires us to take the intentional time to turn once again to God. This season of Lent prepares us for Easter. It calls us to embrace the wilderness of life. And it asks us to tune our hearts to God and reorient our lives so that we can better follow Jesus and where he would lead us. This year, our companion on the Lenten journey, for we never walk alone, is Peter, one of Jesus's disciples. And we will find that as we follow Peter, the path to discipleship, to follow God's call, is not a perfect, straight, simple, narrow path, but instead a wandering one that winds and dips. It's a winding road, and one that Peter wanders along through faith, doubt, friendship, betrayal, hope, learning, and growth. If you want to learn more about Peter, if besides this sermon series, I would recommend there's this great book by Adam Hamilton called Simon Peter that has some really great information and historical information about Peter. So I have one copy. If you would like to borrow it, you're welcome to it. It's a wonderful little book that shares more about Peter's journey. But just to introduce him to you here, he is one of Jesus's disciples, becomes one of them. His name is Simon Peter when Jesus first meets him. And he's mentioned the most out of any of the other disciples in the Gospels. At first, his name is Simon. He's known as Simon. But when Jesus meets him, Jesus kind of gives him a nickname of Peter. And we learn later that his name literally means rock. So he's grounded. He is the rock on which Jesus says he will build the church later in Peter's story. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. We'll hear this story when we get closer to Holy Week. He denies knowing Jesus 3 times, and the rooster crows 3 times. Peter's always messing up and asking the obvious questions, but he ends up becoming the rock upon which the church is built, in spite of and even maybe because of all his mistakes and mishaps along the way. Peter the rock becomes the main character in the book of Acts. He's the founding pope for the church, and there are 2 New Testament letters attributed to him and his profound border crossing ministry. So Peter is a flawed but a faithful disciple, and we can most easily relate to him as we struggle with our own discipleship and what it means to follow Jesus today. One theologian writes this about Peter. Like many of us, Peter has a wandering heart. His journey is not polished or linear or perfect, but he's always tethered to the love of God. When you look closely at Peter's story, you find Jesus at each step along the way, offering him abundance, catching him when he begins to sink, challenging him when he stands in the way, washing his feet, predicting his betrayal, and offering him unconditional agape love. So this Lent, we're joining Peter on this wandering journey to figure out our faith. We're not idolizing him or putting him up on the pedestal, but we're also not vilifying him and saying, oh, don't be like Peter. But instead, we're hoping to wander alongside him, open to what we might learn about Jesus and ourselves by stepping in his shoes. So through this worship series, we'll follow the gospel stories of Peter and use the words of the hymn, Come Thou Fount, which we sang at the beginning of the service, as our guidepost for this journey. So you'll notice the line in Come Thou Fount, bind thy wandering heart to thee. We're asking God to tether our hearts to God. So no matter the which way the wind blows or what external circumstances happen to us, we are grounded in Christ. Our wandering hearts are tethered. So let's strap on our sandals and wander with Peter as we learn who Jesus is calling us to be. Now, we first see Peter in this story primarily in the story known as the Call of the Fisherman. And I don't know about you and how many of you fish, but I'm not a fisherman. I'm not a fisher. Raise your hand if you fish. Are you a fisher? Yeah, got some folks. I'm not a fisher, probably because the first time I tried going fishing, I was probably about 8, 9 years old. I don't know. And I was on the beach and with my friend, and he was teaching me how to fish, I remember. And I was kind of standing behind him, and he was right up against the shore, showing me how to do it. And he took his fishing pole, can't think of the word today. He took his fishing pole and he pulled it back to reel it back. And then he went to go and he had a little tug, because his hook had gotten caught in the top of my hand when he put the hole back. So that was the end of fishing for me. I was not about to do it ever again. Traumatized at 8 years old with the fish hook in the palm of my hand, on top of my hand. But some of you rose your hand, especially I saw a lot in the choir, have had fishing experience. And Simon Peter and his brothers and friends with him were definitely skilled fishermen. I'm sure maybe as children they got hooks stuck everywhere, but they weren't at this point. And now fishermen in the first century at the time of Jesus looks a little bit different how it is today. Although if you've been to the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, they still use a lot of the same techniques of first century fishing. But fishermen in particular in the first century were part of the poor, uneducated, and lower class. And they were considered to be less observant of Jewish law. So they weren't the most popular people. And I'm also sure that they weren't popular because they probably smelled pretty bad too, being around fish all the time. But fishing and the field of fishing was a huge staple for folks. And like today, many people complained about the price of staple goods. Have you seen the price of milk lately? Or groceries just in general were going up. And so they weren't popular for that reason too, because people needed fish and they were getting expensive. So even though fishermen were needed and an important part of the economy, fishermen were not well liked. Adam Hamilton, in his book on Simon Peter, writes, at least one ancient source described fishmongers as, quote, murderous, wealthy thieves. So they were not the most popular people. And yet, this is who Jesus shows up to. The other thing about fishermen in the first century was they had 3 different common ways of fishing. The first was a line and a hook, like the simple line and hook fishing, but it wasn't very profitable because you could only catch 1 fish at a time. They also would cast nets from the shoreline, which was great, but the nets could only reach so far to catch fish. But the most professional and profitable way to catch fish was using a dragnet fishing, where the 2 boats would lower a large net into the water between them, and the fishermen would hold the net on each side, and the boats would row forward, spread out, and be able to catch a large number of fish. And then they would row back in close together and haul the fish in. Now, as you can imagine, this required a lot of strength because in first century Galilee, they didn't have machines to do this for them like they did today. They had to use their own muscles. So it was an exhausting, hard kind of labor. And in our story today, Simon Peter and his brothers had spent a long night of fishing using this difficult dragnet technique, but they had caught nothing in their nets. We can imagine that they are so tired physically from hauling in the nets, from staying up all night, and they're really upset because they haven't caught any fish, and they felt very defeated because this wasn't just a hobby they liked to do, like many of us, those of you who do like fishing, but instead their very lives depended on it. This is how they made their money to feed their families. And on top of that, they had to stay up into the morning hours to clean their nets so that they could have a better night the next time and just wake up and do it all over again. So into this tired, defeated, kind of negative mood is what Jesus walks into. Jesus shows up. He's been doing some ministry already, so people are getting to know who he is, and he's starting to get popular. People have questions and are curious about him, and so there's a crowd following him and pressing in on him. And Jesus needs a better place to preach because there's not really enough room for everybody, and they can't really hear him that well. And so he sees Simon Peter with a boat. Now, despite what it might seem like from our scripture reading, this actually was not the first time that Jesus and Simon Peter have met. If you read the Gospel of John, they've actually met earlier than this. And in fact, Jesus even cared for Simon Peter's mother-in-law when she was struggling. So they've met before. And even though they'd had a good encounter, you can imagine that rowing Jesus out in his boat is probably the last thing that Simon Peter wants to do after a long, hard night. He's defeated, he's tired, he's frustrated, he knows he's going to have to go home and tell his family the disappointing news that he didn't catch anything and go to sleep and then wake up and do it all over again. And yet, when Jesus asks to use Peter's boat, Peter does it anyway. And what Peter learns, and will learn again and again, is that Jesus will routinely inconvenience him and Jesus' others followers. I wonder if there's been a time in your life when Jesus has inconvenienced you. When Jesus has tugged on your heart and asked you to do something, but you were reluctant or hesitant, or you came up with some excuses of why you couldn't possibly do that. It's not good timing. I'm just not feeling it. Oh, it couldn't be me. This is really inconvenient. And you came up with a bunch of excuses to not do the thing that Jesus was calling you to do. I know I have at times been like, oh God, really? Why? Not me, not right now. I don't have time for this. And I make excuses. And that's what happened with Peter. And yet he still listened to Jesus, even though it was inconvenient. Adam Hamilton in his book writes, Jesus doesn't always ask for our help in the way he called on Peter, though. But sometimes his call is in the form of a bulletin announcement at church, or a sermon in which an invitation is given, or maybe we're reading the Bible or praying and we feel a nudge from the Spirit. Often it's a person in need who presents the opportunity. We see someone in need and feel Christ tugging on our heart. And our task then is to pay attention to what's happening around us and to tune our hearts to hear Jesus' call. Out of any of us, Simon Peter had the perfect excuse to tell Jesus, you know what, buddy, not today. I'm really tired. He had been up all night working for his family and he was exhausted. And yet when Jesus asked Peter to row him out so that he could preach to this group of people that had gathered, Peter did it anyway. There was something there that made Peter say, okay, I'll do it. So the story continues, and Jesus tells Simon Peter, now that they're out in the boat and Jesus has presumably done the preaching he first was going to do, now Jesus turns to Simon Peter and says, hey, we're going to go fishing now. And Simon Peter's like, what? I already gave you my boat. Can I just go to bed? Like, come on. I don't want to go fishing. My nets aren't even clean. How are we going to catch anything? And even though he's reluctant, and I can guess, if it was me, it would be the last thing I wanted to do, because Jesus is annoying sometimes like that. But Simon Peter ends up saying to him, because you say so, I'll drop the nets. And maybe Peter was like, all right, if I do this one last thing, this guy's got to leave me alone, right? Maybe it's that. But either way, he drops the nets into the water. And the story goes that even though it was tired, even though it was the wrong time of day to be fishing, and you might have heard this preached before, Jesus tells them to put the net on the wrong side of the boat than what they would know to do as fishermen. Despite all of these things that were risk-taking and seemingly backwards and not the way they've always done it, they catch a huge amount of fish. Because Peter takes a leap of faith. And even though Jesus is nagging on him, I think deep down he must have known, all right, I'm going to surrender my own stuff and I'm going to listen. And they catch a bunch of fish. And in that moment, Simon Peter cries out, leave me, Lord, I am a sinner. Because he doesn't feel worthy of this gift of abundant fish. He didn't work extra hard for it. And so he feels like he doesn't deserve to receive this gift from Jesus. And yet, I want to challenge that because I think he did work extra hard. He worked not physically extra hard, but mentally. He was tired and he did it anyway. He listened to this guy that kept nagging him and he did it anyway. And he took a risk. He did something that went against everything that he had known from the past and his experience. And he trusted God. He trusted Jesus. And he said, all right, I'm going to do it. And then look what happened. An abundance of fish. And when Simon Peter feels like, I don't deserve this, Jesus speaks to his heart and says, do not be afraid. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people. In that moment, Peter is convicted. He is convinced of the power of Jesus. He's felt a nudge before, but now he's witnessed the transformative, amazing power of Christ, and his world is about to be turned upside down. We hear in this gospel story of Simon Peter, an ordinary fisherman who has a bad night. It happens. And then Jesus seeks him out and gets in the boat with him and tells him to try again. And Simon Peter really doesn't want to, but does it anyway. They catch a ton of fish. Simon Peter feels unworthy, and Jesus tells him not to be afraid. Don't worry, I'm about to change your life. Follow me. And while we may not be fishermen, Jesus offers us the same thing. A chance to respond to his calling. To get in the boat, even though we're tired and we feel like we've been in the boat all night, to get back in, saddle up, turn our bad nights around, and change our lives for the better. And all Jesus asks us is that we follow him, that we trust, that we take that leap of faith. Last week, I shared that our church council was on a leadership retreat, and we've been reading this book, Autopsy of a Deceased Church, 12 Ways to Keep Yours Alive. And I invited the leaders at the church council to start passing this book once they finished it along to their committees so that folks who are on committees but not on church council can start reading it. And then once it gets through the committee, to start passing it out to other members and people that are here but not on committees. And we do have some extra copies in the office if you're interested. But what this little book taught us was that it taught us a lot of things, but it taught us that we're not in this alone. It taught us that we need to trust in God. It taught us that there are a lot of things that not only our church, but many other churches, especially in the United States, are doing things that we've always done because that's what we know how to do, and no one ever told us to stop doing those things. And yet, that taking up our time and energy with the past, taking up our time and energy with the way we've always done things before, is preventing us from hearing Jesus's call to get out back in the boat, but try it a different way this time. Maybe try some things that go against everything we've ever known. And that's terrifying because we face out into the world and the unknown of what is church going to be? What does church mean in this next generation, in this next reiteration of what church is? And it doesn't look like people sitting butts in pews on a Sunday morning. It just doesn't. And God is calling us and saying, hey, your church is not dead yet. You have time to fish differently, to cast your nets on a different side of the boat, to trust in Jesus. Don't forget to look because he's sitting right next to you the whole time. And sometimes I just think we forget that he's there, guiding us. We learned and felt from God during this leadership retreat that our church is certainly not dead yet, that we have time to make changes, that we have time to turn toward Jesus, putting aside our fear and embracing the ways Jesus challenges us to follow him. And we're not kidding ourselves. We know it's not going to be easy. We know that it's not always going to be fun. We know that we're going to be tired. And yet, Jesus calls us anyway. And we will find purpose and fulfillment and love greater than we can imagine. And that's the good news. That despite our wandering heart, Jesus seeks us out, us, ordinary people, and he calls us to follow. This week's story ends with a beginning. Jesus says, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of people." And then Simon Peter and his brothers bring the boats to shore and leave everything to follow Jesus. Peter had a wandering heart. Jesus was always there to catch him, to walk beside him, to wash his feet, and to offer love. In Peter's story, we find Jesus. Peter's wandering faith, we will see over the next several weeks, ebbed and flowed. It pushed God away and it pulled God close. But he was always tethered, always connected to the love of God, and that's what kept him going. That's what got him, despite how tired he was, to let Jesus use his boat and to go fishing one more time. This Lent, we're joining Peter in figuring out faith. We'll wander alongside him, glimpsing Jesus through his eyes. And so my prayer for you, for me, for all of us this Lenten season is that in your wandering faith, you wander like Peter, and that along that winding road, I hope that you discover Jesus, who has already discovered you and sought you out and is now calling you to step out of the boat, to take a risk, to do things very differently, and to follow him.